The world has changed utterly, as an Irish poet might say. The global order is now one of disorder. So what does that mean for Europe, the UK, and where does Northern Ireland sit in all of this? What about the jobs market? What do the latest figures tell us about what's happening on the ground? That's all on today's episode of Unpacked. Hello and welcome to Trading Up Unpacked. I'm Jim Fitzpatrick.
And I'm Richard Ramsey.
And this is the business podcast from the Irish News, produced in association with EY, where myself and the professor from Queen's Business School dig deep into the big business issues of the day. And remember, you can get in touch with us at any time on email, tradinguppodcast@gmail.com. Today, Richard, I think we want to dig into the big picture, how it affects us here in Northern Ireland, and indeed we'll dive in a little bit into some of the more detailed stuff specifically relating to Northern Ireland in terms of the jobs market or what other any other surveys out there tell us about what's happening in the business sector. But I suppose we were both at the CBI breakfast, which is a big deal here, and the CBI is the biggest, sort of, if you like, represents the biggest businesses in Northern Ireland. Yeah. They were all together in the Culloden Hotel for the business breakfast. And I suppose the general thrust of things was quite global in its outlook, people needing to think about the big movements of things that are happening around the world.
Yeah, no, it certainly was. And the spectre of geopolitics, which has been sort of talked about for quite a number of months now, again, sort of featured as well.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, there was a time when everything was all about Brexit. What's the UK doing? What's the deal going to be with Europe? And how will that impact Northern Ireland? Right down to the minutiae of that. Now, we're still dealing with the outworkings of that, and there are some details which still are causing trouble for businesses. So that's an issue. But it's almost like everything's much, much bigger. And we're talking about, what Donald Trump is doing, what China is doing, what's happening with the emerging, growing, huge economies like India. And just a sort of sense that, unless we're keeping up to speed with all of this, including things like AI, and that was discussed at the breakfast as well, and how AI is going to revolutionize everything. If you run a small business, you have to be aware of all of these things. You can't ignore them.
Yeah. And even when we think back to our kind of Brexit bubble back in sort of 2016, it was almost the view back then as if we were unique in that the UK was the only country which was snubbing free trade and free markets and embracing almost like protectionism and going inward looking, or what has even then been termed the kind of economic nationalism. But actually, while we're getting a lot of Trump protectionism at the minute, there was quite a reversal from free trade and pushing of protectionist policies, which predated even Brexit.
Yeah, you were, I think, at your table. Were you with Sean Maguire, who is the CBI's man in Brussels? He's one of the CBI representatives who was speaking the other day. Did you bump into him, or were you listening to his presentation?
I listened to him. I was at another table, but
I thought you might have been bending his ear.
Gary MacDonald was at that
one.
Another
fine business guru. Yes, indeed. Gary MacDonald, of course, business editor of the Irish News. But yes, Sean Maguire is the man who leads operations for the CBI in Brussels. Turns out he's a Fermanagh man, but he was at
Tyrone. He was identified as Fermanagh man, but he corrected himself as a Tyrone.
Do you know what? I've just made that mistake, and he's not going to forgive me. Yes, you're right. He was identified as Fermanagh. He's actually from Tyrone. Thank you for correcting me. I don't know why I've made that mistake, but so he's a Tyrone man. Let's get that right. But he's based in Brussels. And therefore, he has to sort of be the ear and eyes of the CBI in Brussels, finding out what's going on there with European policy. A lot of stuff happening with negotiations between the UK and Europe. The Labour government keen to reset, I think is the term, isn't it, the relationships with Europe. And so therefore, that has a big impact on what happens here because of the Windsor Framework and the special rules under which businesses here operate.
Yeah.
So the thing I was interested in unpicking with him was what's happening on that front, but also I think what's happening on the wider front as well with this whole movement and geopolitics. And what Sean essentially was saying to me is that geopolitics, if you like, is a mainstream issue now. And if you run a business, it doesn't matter what your size, these are things you have to consider. So let's hear what he had to say.
Geopolitics is a mainstream business issue now. It is a boardroom issue. It has been discussed as a kind of point one rather than A or B. And there are a number of reasons because of that. It's Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, it's the conflict in the Middle East. It's even dating back to COVID times when supply chains were put under pressure. And I suppose it's been turbo boosted by President Trump's arrival in the White House and his Liberation Day and onslaught with tariffs. So you cannot hide from the fact that the world order has changed significantly.
We used to think of these things as just a given, At one stage, maybe it was the fact that the UK was part of the European community, the European Union. It was also things like the World Trading Order. We didn't have to think about it. There was the WTO, there were rules, countries, by and large, obeyed them. Is that now all gone?
The WTO still exists, but you have to think of the WTO when it was originally set up was a very different animal than it is today. And one of the main factors in that has been the rise of economies, G7 economies or G20 economies, particularly China and India, where the rule book of the WTO was written without their consultation for a time that was very different. They are now major trading partners, leading on many areas, whether it's AI, advanced technology, but the rule book doesn't suit them. But also, you kind of think it is just the Chinese and the Indians. The US have been taking a protectionist approach to trade for as far back as Obama. Even under Biden, you had IRA, which again was a very nationalistic approach to protect American jobs.
What did IRA stand for again?
Industrial Relations Act. And again, it was about the greening of the economy, but it was giving subsidies to US companies that was shutting out and providing a competitive advantage to US companies vis-a-vis non-domestic companies and countries. So that world order is gone. And while the WTO still exists and there's a basic foundation, the rules haven't kept to pace of where the global economy is. And as someone described it to me once, it's like having a football match with a very ineffective referee or no referee whatsoever. So what you have seen, again, is the proliferation of free trade agreements, plurilateral agreements, or more defensive approaches like the US to take a kind of independent tariff approach to dealing with trade and protecting and promoting domestic jobs and growth.
Now, we're in a slightly strange position at the moment where the UK has, it seems, a better deal with the US trade than the EU. And people used to always say that if the EU was a superpower in any sense, it was a superpower in the trade sense. It seems like it's no longer that.
I don't think we should compete or compare the UK with the EU, 15%, 10%. The numbers, 5% doesn't make that big of a difference. But I think you do have to look at where is the EU fitting into this new global order. It has the US on one side and it has China on the other. And it hasn't found itself a strategy of how it competes with both those economic powers. It has quite a defensive approach towards China, driven by some economies that are fearful of the rise of China, particularly in the automotive and the green energy sphere. And then you have the US that really doesn't like the EU's kind of extraterritorial reach and trying to set global standards. And you have to remember, it is a collection of 27. And if I can perhaps kind of hark back to the kind of pre-Brexit days, the UK was that strong advocate for free and fair trade. There isn't really a big player within the EU now that has those principles at its core. France has a very different industrial strategy and very different outlook. Germany has a little bit of a schizophrenic, it's free trade when it suits, it's protectionist. And while you have countries like Ireland, Sweden, the Dutch, who very much share the kind of UK philosophy of free and fair trade, they're much smaller. So you've got these conflicting axes of where the EU goes, and it hasn't realized a strategy of how to deal with a changing world where US and China are the two global powers.
What about the UK-EU relationship, which is so important to businesses here in Northern Ireland? What do you see happening there? You're based in Brussels, you must have your ear to the ground.
I think after almost 10 years of toxic relationships, the common understanding that was agreed as part of the EU-UK summit on the 19th of May drew that line in the sand. It's no longer looking back. It's no longer lose-lose. Let's punish the UK. Let's make this so difficult that no other member state will want to leave the EU, to a realization that within this global context, they need to work in partnership to have a bigger size of the pie in global trade. So the atmospherics are much better with President von der Leyen and the Prime Minister. I'm not sure that that has completely translated down yet to functionary level. You know, the EU, by its very establishment, is a treaty-based, it's a legalistic machine. It doesn't always think of economics as the first. There's rules of the game, and if you have to be part of the club, you have to obey by the rules. If you're not part of the club, you don't get any of the extra benefits. So it's trying to find a new relationship that fits in with the EU's kind of principles, and recognizing that going it alone without working as Europe as a continent and your like-minded partners, nobody will succeed, and the US and China will win.
We are looking towards things like a deal on SPS, and of course that would have a big impact on the operation of the Windsor Framework and trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. How close are we to seeing some form of agreement there?
Again, really welcome the outcome of the common understanding. Business had lobbied for an SPS agreement, had lobbied for an ETS linkage to avoid CBAM, greater cooperation on defence and security. Not much has happened since May. Again, because of the structure of the EU, it has to get negotiating mandates. These haven't been agreed, hope to be agreed in the coming weeks so that we can start negotiations on these critical issues, particularly on SPS in November. But these are complex issues. These are, real technical, detailed standards that the UK and the EU will have to work together and align their policies. Now, we've been out of the EU since 2021. There has been movements on the EU side, there's been movements in the UK side. So bringing those kind of rules back in alignment will take time. And of course, it will also have to allow time for business to adapt. So I think as the Minister Nick Thomas Simmons said in a recent speech, it's going to be 2027 before we see a deal in SPS. It's probably going to take 18 months to negotiate, at which time companies like in Northern Ireland will still have to comply with the requirements under the Windsor Framework, will still have to apply under the requirements under the TCA, but in the hope that in 2027 these will be done away with. Now, that's a cost that business has to incur at the moment and won't get back. So, we would be calling for government to move at pace, but also to provide support to those businesses in that intervening period that allows them to get there to 2027, when hopefully it will be a better and more friction-free trading relationship with the EU.
And of course, Northern Ireland is still part of the EU single market for goods, but it's not part of the single market overall. Yeah. We don't have freedom of movement. And we've seen the impact in certain key industries here with access to labour. Are we going to see any improvement there, or is it just going to be around the edges with things like youth mobility?
I think this is, from a business perspective, this was one of the lost opportunities of the common understanding. We would have liked to have seen much more on free movement, particularly around mobility and business travel. We recognise the sensitivities with the migration debate and the complexities of that, but business mobility is very different from irregular and illegal migration and should be dealt with differently. And both sides fail to grasp the nettle on that. We're hoping, there is one sentence in the common understanding that there would be a dedicated dialogue to look at mobility and look at business travel, but any kind of movement in that is going to be 12 months, 18 months, 2 years. And one of the things that we have mentioned repeatedly to the Treasury, and indeed working with our Business Europe, our European partnering with the Commission, is the restrictions on business travel is a drag on investment. People want to invest, but they want to make sure that they can get their people in and out in a cost-effective way. And whether that is restrictions on visa requirements, sponsorship schemes, it's just an added cost. And if you did away with that, it is one less hurdle in that investment decision.
Sean McGuire, many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Well, Sean Maguire there, who is the CBI's man in Brussels. Famously, Richard, he's a Tyrone man, not a Fermanagh man, apparently. Actually, I did make a mistake earlier there, so forgive me, Sean, but we picked up on a little mistake he made. It was the IRA, not we need to explain that terminology when we use it here, but that's the Inflation Reduction Act. Yes, which of course is a kind of protectionist almost act. We'll come to talk about that in a minute, which was introduced under Biden, I think, wasn't it?
Yep.
But also going further back, we can talk about things that even Obama was doing. So, general thrust of what he's saying. Let's pick up on the big one first of all: geopolitics, the changing kind of global trade order. Well, the world order's gone. What we thought of as the post World War II order is no longer there. Organizations like the World Trade Organization, which people have never really had to consider before, operated at a certain level, set global rules, countries sort of obeyed them, but it's now no longer the case because America is slapping its own tariffs on things. China probably has been doing its own thing for years anyway, and the whole system is now up in the air. And that's a big thing.
Yep. No, absolutely. And well, we hear the term kind of geopolitics. There was a term in 1990 which was coined by Edward Luttwak.
Known well. Edward Luttwak.
And he ended up, he was then an advisor, and he was then focusing on geoeconomics as well. And it was the move of the end of the Cold War, where it was like military power was the dominant feature, where it was the movement towards economic power. And that is something which has become more marked, particularly whenever you've seen the World Trade Order start to unravel. And so we sort of think in geoeconomics, which is now used kind of interchangeably with geopolitics, but it's how trade, sanctions, economic measures, access to resources, commodities, and even in terms of cyber, are now seen to be how a country can throw its weight around.
Yeah, and much more of this kind of interventionist policy from big state players, but with a long-term strategic outlook. So yes, China is run by one party. It's a communist party. It's a communist country, but it very much has a free market, but a free market within certain parameters set by the strategic vision of the Politburo, essentially, of the Chinese Communist Party. Long-term planning, big investment in key industries. And that kind of sets the order of the day. And so it's not, and this is where you got this argument that China, even before what we're talking about now in the States, but China has been operating unfairly, others would say, because the state effectively is putting money into certain key industries, whereas that might not have been allowed in Europe under its own anti-protection rules.
Yeah, or even what China's almost been the key exponent of this kind of geoeconomics, whether it's the kind of Belt and Road Initiative, where it was then investing all around the world and then linked in terms of giving aid to countries in Africa and developing Africa and accessing commodities, raw materials. It's kind of it's been very big on the geoeconomics, and then more recently it's kind of playing Trump at his own game with trying to restrict access to rare earth metals in the same way as Trump in the US is trying to restrict access to semiconductors.
Yeah, I mean, the rare earth thing is interesting because if you look at the history of that, and again, the funny thing is, and this I suppose is the point Sean makes there in a sense, businesses need to consider global politics now, global economics, it's impacting them. But we didn't have to consider these things for years. You just sort of did your business, you traded, you didn't have to consider what was happening with rare earth metals. But now we're actually hearing about it. And China's policy on that has been long-term, as you say. Its Belt and Road Initiative essentially was like a foreign aid policy which was transactional. So it's, if you like, the Western approach, which has now essentially crumbled as well. But the Western approach previously was we, if you like, give money for aid development in the belief that it will, A, improve the conditions in that country, hopefully over the longer term improve the economic conditions, foster democracy, all those kind of softer power ideas. The Chinese are much more transactional about it. We'll give you this money, we'll build these roads, but we want that
ports and
Yeah. But we'll build the ports, the infrastructure, but we want that mine, we want that mountain, we want to take all the, extract all the value from that and have a contract there that's over the longer term that we can control that. So effectively now the situation is, 20 plus years of doing this. China does control sort of vast amounts of kind of key critical minerals that are required for any industry from defense to computing.
Yeah, and I suppose in many ways you had the US and a lot of Western Europe were distracted from the global financial crash and then the Eurozone debt crisis and all of those, that they were kind of inward looking in terms of how they would get over that, while China then quietly went round and in some respects taking over the world and in commodities and in terms of expanding its infrastructure in the Belt and Road initiative.
And this, of course, is a huge card. If Trump liked to use that phrase, about who has all the cards, but this is a huge card that China has to play in any trade negotiations with the US. And that's why perhaps we've seen China standing up to the US very strongly in a way that Europe wasn't able to. And as I was asking Sean McGuire there, people used to say Europe was only a superpower in one thing, and that was trade. But it now looks like it's not a superpower in trade either.
Yeah. And it's even whenever you think of, I think it was Kissinger used to say, who do you phone in the middle of the night? Who do you phone to get to the leader of Europe? And in many ways, we're in that same sort of position with all the geopolitics unfolding. And I think you've almost, what Sean was highlighting, was you've almost got this kind of two-speed world going on, where you've got Trump playing it fast and loose and legal light in terms of when it comes to trade deals or agreements. He's more about just getting agreements which aren't cast in legal stone, but are an agreement with him as long as he is there and until he changes it. Whereas Europe is still very much Brexit. We heard about it's going to be 2027 until there's maybe an SPSS sort of agreement. And in many ways, it's businesses here will be looking at slow developments on the EU front and rapid developments happening on the global front. And it's that kind of two-speed environment is going to be challenging.
Yeah, and I think that's why people sometimes have some admiration for Trump. People in business, they think, he gets things done in a sense, and which is fine when there are things that you want to happen, but not so fine whenever there are things that you don't like. And then we also have all of this policy uncertainty that's entered because we've had Trump say he's doing X, Y, and Z, but still it's hard to determine, I think, as we were discussing before, whether or not this has actually fed through into actual policy, whether this is settled policy and whether it's going to be settled for the sort of medium to longer term.
Yeah, and it's that kind of policy uncertainty, and that's what's different between Trump and Biden, where Biden had introduced through the Inflation Reduction Act, where it was a whole host of subsidies, about something like £400 billion worth of subsidies for clean technology. He was looking at reindustrialization, some of the themes that Trump's coming up with, but there wasn't the level of uncertainty and chopping and changing and what happens next and kind of confrontational with China. And that's kind of really what's new. And there was something I just picked out of the Financial Times today, which was it was EY had come out with some facts on a record proportion of UK-listed companies blamed policy change and geopolitical uncertainty for profit warnings in the third quarter of this year. And, it's all the shifting tariffs, etc. And you compare that to a year ago, only 17% of firms talking about profit warnings were citing geopolitics.
And what's the figure today then? It's up over 40?
So it's 47% now is the figure.
So 47%, and this is UK businesses.
Yeah.
And so they're identifying geopolitics, essentially uncertainty, the global framework, as a main factor as to why they're issuing profit warnings.
Yeah.
So really there, you're just drawing that line straight away. We might say there's all this uncertainty and that sounds a bit vague, but what we're saying is actually firms are now claiming that's what's impacting their bottom line.
Yeah, because it's like it's profit profit margins. And that was similar on our last podcast. I was talking about the Intertrade Ireland's All Island Business Monitor, where it was talking about uncertainty. There's so many more respondents in their survey are saying for profit margins and profitability, they don't know or are unsure. And so what you're seeing, and then even in the likes of the US, what you're seeing is most of the businesses are still taking the bulk of the tariff in terms of taking the hit, but then that's going to change. But if you've just uncertainty of then even Trump's tariffs, what's he going to do next? Because it was about a week ago he then started talking about then he was going to hit China with 100% tariffs again on software products and other things. And it's how do you work out your profitability and what you're going to charge and what your costs and what your revenue will be whenever there's all this chopping and changing.
Hi there, I'm just interrupting for a minute to thank you for being part of the Trading Up community. It's really appreciated. I think we're building a real community of business and entrepreneurship learning. So remember to hit follow or subscribe. It makes a big difference. And please drop me an email on tradinguppodcast@gmail.com. And while I have you, just a quick word about our sponsors, EY. EY's technology experts simplify the complex, whether it's AI, cryptocurrencies, or emerging innovations, empowering you to reimagine what's possible and shape the future with confidence. And EY is committed to positively impacting 1 billion lives by 2030. EY helps organisations embed sustainability at the core of their strategy, driving long-term value for business, people, and the planet. That's it for now. Let's get back to the conversation. Yeah, I wouldn't mind just sort of thinking for a second as well as before we get into sort of some of the specifics in Northern Ireland. But so let's think about the EU for a minute then. So, and the point I made to Sean was, if you look at the trade deals, such as they are, the EU-US deal versus the UK-US deal, basically Europe's paying 5% extra on tariffs compared to the UK, and yet it was supposed to be the superpower, which makes me wonder, when you think about why it couldn't stand up more strongly, is it because it is this amalgam of all the different countries? As I was sort of wondering, is it like this kind of Muppet Man, as they say? If you ever watched the Muppet movie, the Muppet Man is whenever the Muppets all get together, climb one on top of the other, throw a big coat over themselves, and then they become a kind of tall Muppet. But it's an amalgam of Muppets, which, if the coat slips or somebody gives it a push, it falls down. And it's kind of like what's happened here with the EU.
Did you use that analogy with Sean when you were speaking?
I didn't go into the intricacies of the Muppet Man theory, but, maybe I should have done. So the Muppet Man of the EU, if you like, has kind of fallen over here. It's capitulated to Trump. It's paying higher tariffs than the UK, which is a much smaller country, a much smaller economy. So why did it not feel it could stand up? And one of the issues, before we maybe talk about security, but one of the issues is that all these competing players. So we had the Germans saying, please don't tax our cars. We had the Irish saying, please don't tax pharma. So the Irish may be, as Sean said, all for free trade, but let's face it, they didn't want any impact on their trade. And if it impacted somebody else's in Europe, they could live with that and vice versa. So it was really fundamentally quite weak when it went into those negotiations with Trump.
Yes, but I suppose it was part of that weakness in trade was because of its weakness with probably Ukraine and the whole reliance on the US for its so-called security umbrella. And given that Trump was then wanting all the EU member states and all the other NATO countries, bar the US, to be stumping up and increasing their share and funding defense spending, and that's kind of a big ask. So do you end up starting, we know how volatile Trump is in terms of how he could change, so I'm sure it would have been discussed within Brussels is 15% okay and not as bad as it could be, and what is the risk if we start messing about and trying to strong arm him? Does he just then, in terms of the arm wrestle analogy, he just then totally outperforms us in terms of the defence spending.
So really, you're saying that obviously they had to think about the Ukraine situation. They're in a negotiation which is primarily about trade, but because we're talking about the world order no longer existing as we thought, Trump could just as easily say, well, look, I've had enough of this whole Ukraine business. He could even have walked out of NATO, which he tried to do in his first term. And then suddenly Europe is not only in a trade war with the US, but is having to fund and fight the war in Ukraine itself. So that's really, it's a consideration that can't be kind of taken away from what it was doing on the trade negotiations.
And it's probably been an element of still kicking the can down the road, because with the assumption things might change. And do we end up, things might change, whether at the midterms, whether at the Trump at the end of his term, whether it's going to change. But I was listening to an interesting podcast, which was then sort of discussing about, even if the Democrats were to get in, are they more likely to keep the tariffs which Trump has in place rather than reduce them? So it's I think people would be misguided if they think that we could end up then having at the next election, if it was like, say, for example, Democrats got into power, that we would go back. It would almost be like the Bobby Ewing shower moment in Dallas, where it was all a dream, and we go back to the world that we were in terms of the global order and stuff. That isn't going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, really. Yeah, it's amazing what you can learn from both 1980s soap operas and indeed the Muppets while we're at it. Yeah. So you're right. There's no Bobby Ewing moment here. And of course, it's because, let's face it, they are drawing a lot of revenue from those tariffs. And if they're going to get rid of the tariffs, they're going to have to find another place to find that revenue. So things will settle into some sort of new norm, even if it is this kind of slightly mad world that we've never really experienced before.
Yeah, and it's almost like on the one hand, the EU is still in its rules-based order when it's looking to itself and how it deals with the UK and all the legalese and everything, whereas elsewhere it's this kind of like post-rules world, as Sean was talking about. It's like maybe not having a referee involved, and that makes it a dangerous and uncertain world, particularly for businesses.
Yeah, and the EU doesn't, as he was identifying, hasn't really worked out what its strategic pathway through all of this is yet. Obviously, because a lot of the countries, like let's say take France, has its own political problems. Germany hasn't been particularly settled either, so they are trying to deal with their own domestic issues, and therefore the coherence of the bloc isn't there in terms of working out how does it respond to this new world disorder.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And then it's whether, but then equally by doing that, then that's kind of a sign of weakness whenever you see that it's US and China are the ones who are getting involved, and the EU is almost like an also-ran and or collateral damage to whatever trade spats that the US and China get involved in.
Yeah. Actually, interestingly, there's a company in Belfast, when we talk about China and holding the cards in relation to rare earths, there's a company in Belfast, strong ties to Queen's, Ionic Technologies, which is basically developing a new process for being able to recycle magnets. Magnets rely a lot on rare earth metals, and if you can recycle them properly, which to date has been a difficult process, and they have a new way of doing it, which could be very commercial, then you will not have to rely so much on those rare earth metals.
Is that by getting a very big, strong magnet and then you attract all the magnets?
I don't know. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And what's interesting is it's spun out of Queen's. They're developing the whole prototype model in Belfast, in Belfast Harbour. And that actually is the kind of solution so as not to have to rely on all of these rare earth metals in the future for that particular thing. And of course, magnets important for defence, computing, all sorts of things that more intelligent people know more about than me. But just that little nugget there for anyone who wants to look up Ionic Technology is definitely worth a look.
But even on the rare earths, when we're talking about the kind of tensions that are going on at the minute, that isn't new in a sense, because China has been doing that with Japan probably around about a decade ago by restricting its access. So it's always, obviously China and Japan have their own history, but it's like China has then been limiting imports of Japanese cars and also limiting Japan's access to Chinese rare earth metals. So a lot of this has been going on in the background, but it's just gone up by, a factor of 10 or 100 in terms of the severity of what they're doing.
Yeah, and we've yet to see how it all will shake down between the US and China. They're both holding, different cards. They're both going to sort of see who blinks first, or maybe they will to come to some mutually acceptable accommodation. So then, dealing with the UK scenario in all of this, well, we've talked a little bit about the trade deal that the UK has done with the US, but what about that UK-EU relationship? And again, the new government talked about a reset in relationships. It has done as much probably as it can to date in terms of the tone, getting that common understanding, having a framework for building a better relationships. But then you get into all this kind of EU speak, as I say, getting the mandate agreed, getting the different countries signed up to it, getting the detail worked out. This contrasts so much, doesn't it, from the Trump approach? Whereas, as you say, who do you phone in the middle of the night in Europe? The UK has to work through this slow process to get an improvement, which will ultimately feed back down to Northern Ireland and the operation of the Windsor Framework and things like it, which are costing businesses money.
And it's also, Keir Starmer is also kind of walking the tightrope between both him and Rachel Reeves in terms of their need to get the UK economy growing again. And apparently the Office for Budget Responsibility, whenever it's expected to downgrade its forecasts and due to productivity downgrades at the same time as the budget on the 26th of November, they're going to be, it's in the papers today that they're going to cite Brexit as being one of the problems behind that alongside COVID. So on the one hand, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, to try and get the growth that they desperately need to improve the public finances, they want to try and get a bit more single market, and go back to and try and get sort of deals, or trying to. They had a hard Brexit, and it's to try and soften it around the edges, and that's probably something that they would want to have as long as they're in power. But then they're wanting to do that, but then you've got politically in the UK, you've got reform and what's going on there, and how any moves which are going towards that are seen as toxic. So
when you get into the whole thing about movement, freedom of movement is clearly the big worry that they have. Interesting, I don't know if you saw, did you see Leo Varadkar, former Taoiseach, of course, now kind of traveling the world, doing different things, and teaching at Harvard, I think, as well. But he was, and he was interviewed, I think, in relation to the Labour Party at the time of the conference, and it was one of those. Well, I'm loath to offer advice, but if they'd asked me, and his view was that they basically came to power without a vision and without a. It was kind of managerial, their prospectus. And now they're kind of managing things day to day without any great vision as to what they want to achieve. And he argued that they should have set themselves the big vision of rejoining the single market. Now, of course, that would have opened up, which they didn't want to do in the election campaign, the whole Brexit debate, because you'd been into talking about freedom of movement. But the fact that they're sort of almost trying to do it now by the back door doesn't really work either. And it's an interesting point, like, could they, and it's maybe, it's done, so it's too late now, but if they had put it into their manifesto, could they have argued enough at the time and had a proper reset of relations, which would have unlocked the labour mobility, which would have been good for business, regardless of what people might have said on immigration?
I think if that had been done last year, that would have been just seen as like too premature, whereas my sense is that that would have been something towards the end of this parliamentary term they would be sort of moving for, and then to potentially go for that. But so far, the first year and a bit hasn't gone according to plan, assuming they had one.
Yeah.
In terms of that, it's been extremely challenging. And in many ways, I think the way Labour were in the last general election, it reminded me a bit of kind of Kamala Harris against Donald Trump, where it was not telling the American electorate of who you are, what you stand for, and what you want to do, but it's more highlighting the opposition and that you're not them, and that by voting for Kamala Harris or voting for the Labour Party, you're not the Tories and you're not Donald Trump. But you still need to know that you need to have that's kind of like negative electioneering, as opposed to going, this is what we want to do and we want to achieve X, Y, and Z, and we have this grand vision of where we're going to take the country. And I think that's a problem with Keir Starmer at the minute, is they don't seem to have the vision, and they're just going sticking plaster on the public finances to how do we get through to November, then to the end of November, to that budget. Then what happens? How does that go? It's real short-termism.
Yeah. This kind of, say, day-to-day managerial approach. And so Labour, we're not part, as I said when I was chatting to Sean, we're not part of the single market when it comes to the freedom of movement of people. We're part of the single market when it comes to freedom of movement of goods. So that puts Northern Ireland in a slightly strange position. And you can see the difference now in terms of labour mobility. You just go south of the border and go to a hotel or whatever, and you'll automatically encounter people with Polish accents or Eastern European accents in a way that here we did a few years ago, but they aren't here anymore. They went home.
I had an Eastern European scaffolder for fixing a roof repair, so it was definitely Eastern European, but yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you can sort of see the difference. And you speak to people in business here, and they'll say one of the ways they manage their costs, say in hospitality, is by not opening the restaurant, say certain days of the week, by only opening the days when they know they're going to be actually busy. But a lot of that's dictated to by a difficulty in recruitment as well. So what can we see? You've been looking, I think, at what's happening in the local jobs market. Anything that's sort of jumping out at you in terms of the jobs market?
Yeah, I suppose just to finish off on what you were saying there, I suppose how the business community responded, if we think back to the EU enlargement and the arrival of Eastern Europeans into the workforce back in sort of 2004 or so. The business community here sort of obviously welcomed open arms, but in many ways we didn't deal with the long-term skills challenges that we had, and people who are long-term economically inactive. And in many ways, what's now happened is we don't have access, as business community, don't have access to Eastern Europeans. And in many ways, like Poland has been such a successful economy, and it's keeping a lot of its labour and people who would have previously come over here. But the challenge is now, you, I suppose, didn't fix the roof when the sun was shining, in terms of you didn't try and reduce economic inactivity. Those people who are long-term sick, could you have done something with them? And now there's skills shortages. We've got unemployment. The latest figures show unemployment has risen to a 33-month high of 2.6%, but that's still historically very low. UK rate's 4.8%. But there are challenges of where are you going to get the skills and the labour from. What we've seen in some of the other labour market statistics, and when we look at employment, the HMRC payrolls figures. So again, September, they're hitting another kind of record high. But if you actually scrape beneath the surface there and you look at accommodation and food services, which is the hospitality sector, it has been seeing, as of, the sector figures are up to July, it is then seeing its employment has fallen by about 800 or 900 over the last kind of several months. And again, it's this sector which has been hit hardest alongside retail, with Rachel Reeves' hospitality pass, or it's that hospital pass, the hit of national living wage increases, national insurance contribution increases, and then all the kind of private sector rental increases, where Northern Ireland, and indeed it's Belfast, is seeing the strongest growth in private sector rent of any city in the UK. And then food price inflation, all of that is kind of impacting. So, and then we've got our long-standing issues, so the latest labour market figures are then showing that economic inactivity seems to be then turning back up again. And if we look at economically inactive, what's happening there, or who are they? Those are the people who are neither in work or looking for work. We have 117,000 long-term sick
117,000 in the Northern Ireland.
in Northern Ireland, long-term sick.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And these are people that would otherwise, supposedly be available for work, and they're not.
some of them would, but some of them would still long-term sick. They would still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's a big proportion here.
And if you look at it, it's 1 in 10 of the working age population. So when you're looking as a business to then try and select and attract somebody, straight away, 10% of the working age population are ruled out. But
Yeah.
But on the hiring front as well, I'm involved with nijobs.com, and they're doing a hiring trends update. They do it twice a year, and it's highlights some kind of interesting things which are going on in the world of hiring. And while hiring, the number of vacancies, and we're looking at the year to date up until September, is up by about 2.5% relative to last year. We're seeing this survey then includes asked 150 recruiters about what they're experiencing, and 72% of them reported finding difficulties getting the candidate with the right skills. And so that's 72% finding candidates with the right skills, but you had 2/3 of all employers were then experiencing difficulties recruiting in the last 6 months.
Yes, they're saying that's their top challenge. And so what does that tell us? I mean, even going back, as you say, things were maybe a bit too easy when we had all that access to, Eastern European labour. And even if we were still part of part of the EU, that may not be the case anymore, because, as you say, countries like Poland, their economies are so strong, people will probably find better opportunities there. But we didn't do the hard work to try and ensure that we could get people off the long-term sick, or get them the skills that were needed. And so now, when the job market is squeezed like this, and employers are trying to get people into the workplace, they're finding it a real challenge getting people with the right skills.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I can sort of think back to probably then, even like if you're thinking 15 years ago, maybe even more, 10 to 15 years ago, skills shortages and the pressure of skills wasn't the same degree of a problem that it is today.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of other kind of key things which are interesting just within it as well, in terms of the hiring challenges. Well, 2/3 have been experiencing difficulties hiring. There's 55% of recruiters have been challenged by candidates receiving counter offers.
Right.
So clearly that highlights then that obviously the incumbent employer, they know how difficult it is to maybe fill a place. So if one of their staff members is seeking to go elsewhere, that they will respond with counter offers. What the key motivation for any of the job seekers at the minute is salary. Mm-hmm. That is front and center for individuals, whereas if we sort of saw the pendulum swing after COVID more towards the kind of work-life balance and flexibility, and salary was less of an issue. But if you think what's happening with the kind of cost of living issues, house prices, cost of rent, etc., that now that's it's swung back to salary. That's not to say that flexible working isn't important. It still is. Interestingly, it's now essentially the candidates. It's a bit like the Boris Johnson having their cake and eat it. They want the salary, the flexible working, and the hybrid working from home, and they want all of that. And so you now have that's employers are finding difficulty with that. So 60% of employers have found it difficult to meet flexible working expectations. So yeah,
it's kind of interesting. Just when we started talking about the world order having changed, WTO, all these rules that we never even had to consider, that ruled how the way the global economy worked in relation to trade and other things, have now been upended. But when you get down to the detail on things like employment, COVID and technology has totally transformed that as well, just in the last few years. I mean, the idea that, back in, say, 2015, you could have said to your employer, I fancy working from home Mondays and Fridays. You'll give me the time to do that, and I'll see you when I see you Tuesday to Thursday. Can you imagine what would they have done if you'd suggested that one back in the day to, I don't know, the guys at Ulster Bank?
Well, that was, I'm sort of even thinking back to, say, 10 years ago, when it's, even if somebody was dared to leave at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, it would be almost thought, are you having a half day? And it's...
Of course, people got round these sort of things by hanging their jackets on the back of the seat, didn't they? This kind of thing where, they must be just away off having a coffee. Of course, they've got a spare jacket and they've headed home, or they've gone off to meet somebody in town or whatever it might be. Of course, there were ways around it all. But yeah, our expectations have changed, and let's face it, some of that's good, and some companies can benefit from flexibility, and it's great. We're in a position at the moment where, because the labour market's tight, people are able to demand these things. But if we're starting to see a bit of a shift, a bit of a loosening up, we're seeing graduate unemployment being a big issue, perhaps those people seeking jobs will no longer be able to call the shots in the way that maybe they have been to date.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's one of the legacies of COVID. Unfortunately, is we're seeing it used to be thought of that long-term sick was the kind of people in their my kind of age, in their 50s, whereas we've been seeing a significant increase in the number of young people aged 16 to 24. So-called NEETs, that's not in education, employment or training. So there's now 25,000 of those people. And, the Northern Ireland Skills Council there recently announced that they expect the number of young people, these NEETs, is going to increase by 2,000 per year. So that creates a burden, because we think of all the problems that we have with welfare and welfare spending as it is. And if you've then got at the younger generation, and we've got an ageing population and all the additional cost burden of the health service and all of that, that's both a worry from a cost perspective, but also in terms of labour supply and where are you going to get the staff from?
So that's the jobs market at the moment. What about any other indicators? I know you're always a fan of the PMI survey. In fact, you used to front up on that one, didn't you, when you were at the bank?
Yes.
Any more details? Is that out recently?
Yes, we had the latest one for September, and I suppose we had...
And of course, we should explain, many people will know this already, Purchasing Managers Index, isn't that right?
Yes, it's kind of been rebadged or renamed as then the private sector, or private... What is it again? It's a growth... It's a growth tracker, is
right.
What it's now called. So it's the artist formerly known as PMI. Still is the PMI, but
we'll call it the growth tracker. Yeah, which is good when it's growing, but maybe not if it starts to go the other way. But yeah, so what's the latest from that?
So the latest one for September is business activity 44.2, which anything below 50 is contraction. The lower the number, the faster the rate of decline. So that's the 9th contraction in the last 10 months. Sharpest decline in 33 months as well. What respondents in the survey are saying is that, again, economic uncertainty, contract delays, muted demand among some of the factors, and services is weak in that, weakest in 2 years. And we're also seeing, in terms of new orders, forward-looking indicator as well, it has been falling for the 11th successive month in September. Good news is then employment still increasing, albeit modestly. Also a bit of respite in terms of inflationary pressures, both input cost inflation and output prices, which is the price that the firms charge for their goods and services, still going up, but it's easing a bit. But so this is really, in terms of sentiment, is clearly deteriorating, and we covered in a number of podcasts ago then just about, on the one hand, we're seeing some of the official data for economic growth. The composite economic index was very strong in the second quarter of this year, 2% quarterly growth. But where this differs is this is more businesses, the proportion of businesses who are reporting a decline on a monthly basis. So it doesn't quantify the scale of it. And so what could that mean? So that could mean that you could have proportionately more firms are experiencing falling levels of activity. But then when you look at the firms which are, we talked about Monjaro, those pharmacies or whatever, the volume of actual, in terms of monetary volume of what they're doing, is really large, and that would outweigh the ones which are showing decline. So that's how you can have kind of two surveys saying different things. It is still strange, the kind of scale of it, but that's what it's indicating.
So a disconnect between PMI, growth tracker, and maybe the composite index. And I suppose we'll only know in the months ahead as to, what the actual story is on the ground. But certainly not great, I suppose, if all those firms are suggesting a bit of a contraction. But look, there's plenty there to keep us thinking. Thanks, Richard, for taking us through all of that again today. And remember, of course, that Trading Up is all about helping people in business learn from others in business, and indeed digging into these big business and economic issues. If you have anything you want to ask us, maybe we'll get to a stage where we could do a bit of a Q&A with some of the audience. Richard can answer any question.
Just a cue.
We'll keep it a secret before we reveal it to him on the podcast. So please email us at tradinguppodcast@gmail.com. You can also, of course, comment on any of the social channels, and we can include that. So if you're watching on our YouTube channel, please hit subscribe and follow us on all the podcast platforms, or at least one of them, and make any comments you like, and we will try and come back to you. So you can also find my Trading Up Insights newsletter on LinkedIn. So thanks a million for joining us today. We'll see you all soon again on Trading Up or Trading Up Unpacked, which is produced in association with EY. See you soon.